Hey everybody, this is a piece by Tony Cliff. It's an appendix to his book State Capitalism in Russia. It's titled An Examination of Trotsky's Definition of Russia as a Degenerated Workers' State. The sections in it include: Can a state not under workers' control be a workers' state? Russia's definition as a workers' state and the Marxist theory of the state. The form of property considered independently of the relations of production, a metaphysical abstraction. Arab feudalism, an example of class society based on state property. The Russian bureaucracy, a gendarme who appears in the process of distribution. Social revolution or political revolution. Trotsky's last book. The internal forces are not able to restore individual capitalism in Russia. What conclusion as regards its class character? The quote, new democracies, end quote, and the definition of Russia as a workers' state. Are Russia's war victories proof that she is a workers' state? What prevented Trotsky from renouncing the theory that Russia is a workers' state? Those are the sections. The little intro says, not the intro, it's Cliff's intro. Trotsky's analysis of the Stalinist regime has its point of departure in Bolshevism. Marxism and Bolshevism contraposes Marxism and Stalinism, the October Socialist Revolution, and the bureaucratic counter-revolution. Being a disciple of Trotsky and believing with Trotsky that what is vital in assessing Stalinism is to approach Stalinism from the standpoint of its relation to Marxism-Leninism, the present writer thinks it is necessary to devote the greatest attention to a critical assessment of Trotsky's analysis of the Stalinist regime. I don't know if he's using the word Marxism-Leninism affirmatively or critically here. If he's speaking of Marxism-Leninism as like the ideology of the Soviet Union, or as Marxism-Leninism is something that's ostensibly external to Stalinism. I think many would argue that Stalinism's ideological manifestation is Marxism-Leninism, and that Leninism and Marxism are distinct things, and one can be a Marxist and can be a Leninist at the same time, or at least according to a lot of people, and not be a Marxist-Leninist. Marxism and Leninism being like a specific label for a certain dogmatic body of ideas that developed in the Soviet Union in the Stalin period. But who knows? Can a state not under workers' control be a workers' state? In Trotsky's works, we find two different and quite contradictory definitions of workers' state. According to one, the criterion of workers' state is whether the proletariat has direct or indirect control, no matter how restricted over the state power. That is, whether the proletariat can get rid of the bureaucracy by reform alone without the need for revolution. In 1931, Trotsky wrote, quote, the recognition of the present Soviet state as a workers' state not only signifies that the bourgeoisie can conquer power in no other way than by armed uprising, but also that the proletariat of the USSR has not forfeited the possibility of submitting the bureaucracy to it, or at reviving the party again and amending the regime of the dictatorship without a new revolution, with the methods and on the road of reform. End quote, Trotsky. In a letter to Borodai, a member of the opposition group called Democratic Centralists, Trotsky expresses this idea even more clearly. The letter is undated, but all indications show that it was written at the end of 1928. One second. Can't find Borodai, I was looking for him. Anyway, Trotsky writes, quote, "Is the degeneration of the apparatus and of the Soviet power a fact? That is the second question," end quote. You write. There is no doubt that the degeneration of the Soviet apparatus is considerably more advanced than the same process in the party apparatus. There's no doubt that the degeneration of the Soviet apparatus is considerably more advanced than the same process in the party apparatus. Nevertheless, it is the party that decides. At present, this means the party apparatus. The question thus comes down to the same thing. Is the proletarian kernel of the party, assisted by the working class, capable of triumphing over the autocracy of the party apparatus, which is fusing with the state apparatus? Whoever replies in advance that it is incapable, thereby speaks not only of the necessity of a new party on a new foundation, but also of the necessity of a second and new proletarian revolution, end quote. Trotsky. Later in the same letter, Trotsky says, quote, "If the party is a corpse, a new party must be built on a new spot, and the working class must be told about it openly. If Thermidor is completed, and if the dictatorship of the proletariat is liquidated, the banner of the second proletarian revolution must be unfurled. That is how we would act if the road of reform, for which we stand, proved hopeless," end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's second definition has a fundamentally different criterion. No matter how independent the state machine be from the masses, and even if the only way of getting rid of the bureaucracy be by revolution, so long as the means of production are statified, the state remains a worker state with the proletariat the ruling class. Thus, in The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky writes, quote, "The nationalization of the land, the means of industrial production, transport, and exchange, together with the monopoly of foreign trade, constitute the basis of the Soviet social structure. Through these relations established by the proletarian revolution, the nature of the Soviet Union as a proletarian state is for us basically defined." End quote. Trotsky. 3 conclusions are to be drawn from this. A. Trotsky's second definition of the workers' state negates the first. B. If the second definition is correct, the Communist Manifesto is incorrect in saying, quote, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state," end quote. And it was incorrect in saying, quote, "The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class," end quote. Furthermore, in this case, neither the Paris Commune nor the Bolshevik dictatorships were worker states, as the former did not satisfy the means of production, did not statify the means of production at all, and the latter did not do so for some time. C. If the state is the repository of the means of production, and the workers do not control it, they do not own the means of production, i.e., they are not the ruling class. The first definition admits this, the second avoids it, but does not disprove it. New section. Russia's definition as a worker state and the Marxist theory of the state. The assumption that Russia is a degenerated worker state must lead to conclusions in direct contradiction to the Marxist concept of the state. An analysis of the role of what Trotsky called political revolution and social counter-revolution will prove this. In The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky writes, quote, "In order better to understand the character of the present Soviet Union, let us make 2 different hypotheses about the Soviet Union's future. Let us assume first that the Soviet bureaucracy is overthrown by a revolutionary party, having all the attributes of the old Bolshevism, enriched moreover by the world experience of the recent period. Such a party would begin with the restoration of democracy in the trade unions and the Soviets. It would be able to and would have to restore freedom of Soviet parties. Together with the masses and at their head, it would carry out a ruthless purgation of the state apparatus. It would abolish ranks and decorations, all kinds of privileges, and would limit inequality in the payment of labor to the life necessities of the economy and the state apparatus. It would give youth the free opportunity to think independently, learn, criticize, and grow. It would introduce profound changes in the distribution of the national income, in correspondence with the interest and will of the worker and peasant masses. But so far as concerns private property relations, the new power would not have to resort to revolutionary measures. It would retain and further develop the experiment of planned economy. After the political revolution, that is, the deposing of the bureaucracy, the proletariat would have to introduce in the economy a series of very important reforms, but not another social revolution, ... If, to adopt a second hypothesis, a bourgeois party were to overthrow the ruling Soviet caste, it would find no small number of ready servants among the present bureaucrats, administrators, technicians, party directors, party secretaries, and privileged upper circles in general. A purgation of the state apparatus would, of course, be necessary in this case too, but a bourgeois restoration would probably have to clean out fewer people than a revolutionary party. The chief task of the new power would be to restore private property and the means of production, ... Notwithstanding that the Soviet bureaucracy has gone far towards preparing a bourgeois restoration, the new regime would have to introduce in the matter of forms of property and methods of industry, not a reform, but a social revolution, ... Trotsky. Let us examine this. During bourgeois political revolutions, for instance, the French revolutions of 1830 and 1848, the form of government changed to a greater or lesser degree, but the type of state remained the same. Quote, special bodies of armed men, prisons, etc., end quote, independent of the people and serving the capitalist state. Hitler's victory in Germany certainly brought with it a large-scale purge of the state apparatus, but the state machine as a whole was not smashed, remaining fundamentally the same. There is a much closer connection between content and form in a worker state than in any other state. Even therefore, if we assume that political revolutions can take place in a worker state, one thing is clear: the same worker state machine must continue to exist as such as before the political proletarian revolution. If Russia is a worker state, even though the Revolutionary Workers' Party may carry out a large-scale, quote, purge, end quote, of the state apparatus when it comes to power, it must be able to use and will use the existing state machine. On the other hand, if the bourgeoisie comes to power, it will not be able to use the existing state machine, but it will be compelled to smash it and build another on its ruins. Are those the conditions obtaining in Russia? To pose the question correctly goes halfway to answering it. It is surely evident that the Revolutionary Party will not use the MVD, nor the bureaucracy, nor the standing army. The Revolutionary Party will have to smash the existing state and replace it by Soviets, people's militias, etc. As against this, if the bourgeoisie comes to power, it can certainly not use the MVD, the regular army, etc. Trotsky avoids the application of the Marxist theory of the state to the political revolution and social counter-revolution in Russia, partly by saying that the Revolutionary Party, quote, would begin with the restoration of democracy in the trade unions and the state, and the Soviets, end quote. But actually, there are neither trade unions nor Soviets in Russia in which democracy can be restored. The question is not one of reforming the state machine, but of smashing the state machine and building a new state. Whether we assume that the proletariat must smash the existing state machine or coming to power while the bourgeoisie can use it, or whether we assume that neither the proletariat nor the bourgeoisie can use the existing state apparatus, the, quote, purgation of the state apparatus, end quote, necessarily involving such a deep change as would transform it qualitatively. On both assumptions, we must come to the conclusion that Russia is not a worker state. To assume that the proletariat and the bourgeoisie can use the same state machine as the instrument of their supremacy is tantamount to a repudiation of the revolutionary concept of the state expressed by Marx, Engels, and Trotsky. New section. The form of property considered independently of the relations of production, a metaphysical abstraction. Every Marxist recognizes that the concept of private property in itself, independent of the relations of production, is a suprahistorical abstraction. Human history knows the private property of the slave system, the feudal system, the capitalist system, all of which are fundamentally different from one another. Marx ridiculed Proudhon's attempt to define private property independently of the relations of production. What transforms the means of production into capital is the sum total of the relations of production. As Marx said, quote, "In each historical epoch, property is developed differently and under a set of entirely different social relations." Thus, to define bourgeois property is nothing less than to give an exposition of all the social relations of bourgeois production. To try to give a definition of property as an independent relation, a category apart, an abstract eternal idea, can be nothing but an illusion of metaphysics or jurisprudence. One second. It's from Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. All the categories which express the relations between people in the capitalist process of production, value, price, wages, etc., constitute an integral part of bourgeois private property. It is the laws of movement of the capitalist system which defines the historical social character of capitalist private property, and which differentiate capitalist private property from other sorts of private property. Proudhon, who abstracted the form of property from the relations of production, quote, "entangled the whole of these economic relations," bracket, the capitalist relations of production, and bracket, in the general juristic conception of, quote, "property," end quote. End quote. Therefore, quote, Proudhon could not get beyond the answer which Brissot, in a similar work, had already, before 1789, given in the same words, quote, "property is theft," end quote, end quote. Let me see if I can find who Brissot is. I don't know if this is who is, it looks like it might be referring to a guy from the French Revolution, so let's see what it says. According to Wikipedia, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, who lived from 1754 to 1793, also known as Brissot de Warville, was a French journalist, abolitionist, and revolutionary leading the faction of Girondins, initially called Brissotins, at the National Convention in Paris. The Girondins, I guess that's how you say it. I don't know. I'll say who. Let me see.
Girondin.
The Girondins favored exporting the revolution and opposed a concentration of power in Paris. Brissot collaborated with the Mercure de France and the Courrier de France, Courrier de l'Europe, which sympathized with the insurgents in the American colonies. In February 1788, Brissot founded the Anti-Slavery Society of the Friends of the Blacks. With the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789, Brissot became one of its most vocal supporters. As a member of the Legislative Assembly, Brissot advocated for war against Austria and other European powers in order to secure France's revolutionary gains, which led to the War of the First Coalition in 1792. Brissot voted against the immediate execution of Louis XVI, which made him unpopular by the Montagnards, and he was friendly with Jean-Paul Marat, but in 1793 they were the greatest enemies. On the 3rd of April 1793, Maximilien Robespierre declared in the convention that the whole war was a prepared game between Dumouriez and Brissot to overthrow the First French Republic. Conflicts with Robespierre, who accused Brissot of royalism, eventually brought about his downfall. On the 8th of October, the convention decided to arrest Brissot. Like Madame Roland and Pétion, Brissot was accused of organizing or taking part in conspicuous dinners. At the end of October 1793, Brissot was guillotined along with 28 other Girondins by Charles Henri Sanson. So that's who Brissot is. Let me reread the sentence back in the text. Therefore, quote, Proudhon could not get beyond the answer which Brissot in a similar work had already before 1789 given in the same words, quote, property is theft, end quote, end quote. Marx. Poverty of philosophy. That one private property can have a different historical character to another can be the stronghold of a different class than the other was made quite clear by Marx. That the same can apply to statified property also is not so evident. The main reason for this is that the known history of humanity has, in the main, been the history of the class struggle on the basis of private property. Cases of class differentiation on the basis of other than private property are not very numerous, and on the whole not very well known. Nevertheless, they have existed. As the first example, let us take a chapter from the history of Europe, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. The church had tremendous tracts of land on which hundreds of thousands of peasants labored. The relations between the church and the peasants were the same feudal relations as existed between the feudal manor owner and his peasants. The church as such was feudal. At the same time, none of the bishops, cardinals, etc. had individual rights over feudal property. It is the relations of production which define the class character of the church property, which is feudal notwithstanding the fact that it was not private. It might be said that the Catholic Church was only an appendage to the feudal system as a whole, hence its feudal character, but this argument is irrelevant. We do not wish to explain why the Catholic Church rose, concentrating in its hands tremendous tracts of land and entering into feudal relations with the peasants tilling it. We only wish to show that one and the same relations of production can be expressed in different forms of property, the one private, the other institutional. From the history of the East, we may draw numerous examples of systems of economy with deep class differentiations based not on private property but on state property. Such systems existed in Pharaonic Egypt, Muslim Egypt, Iraq, Persia, and India. That the state-owned land was, it seems, mainly due to the fact that agriculture depended entirely on the irrigation system in these countries, which in turn was dependent on the activity of the state. The following example is sufficiently instructive to warrant the digression. New section, Arab feudalism, an example of class society based on state property. Let's see. One second. Let us examine the main characteristics of Arab feudalism under the Mamelukes. Or the Mamluk is what it looks like. Mamluk or Mameluke, this is from Wikipedia, translated as, quote, one who is owned, end quote, meaning, quote, slave, end quote, were non-Arab, ethnically diverse, mostly Turkic, Caucasian, Eastern, and Southeastern European enslaved mercenaries, slave soldiers, and freed slaves who were assigned higher-ranking military and administrative duties, serving the ruling Arab and Ottoman dynasties in the Muslim world. The most enduring Mamluk realm was the knightly military class. in medieval Egypt, which developed from the ranks of slave soldiers. Originally, the Mamluks were slaves of Turkic origins from the Eurasian steppe, but the institution of military slavery spread to include Circassians, as Abkhazians, Georgians, Armenians, Russians, and Hungarians, as well as people from the Balkans, such as Albanians, Greeks, and South Slavs. They also recruited from the Egyptians. The Mamluk Ghulam phenomenon, as David Ayalon dubbed the creation of the specific warrior class, was of great political importance. For one thing, it endured for nearly 1,000 years from the 9th century to the early 19th century. Over time, Mamluks became a powerful military knightly class in various Muslim societies. They were controlled by dynastic Arab rulers, particularly in Egypt and Syria, but also in the Ottoman Empire, Levant, Mesopotamia, and India. Mamluks held political and military power. In some cases, they attained the rank of sultan, while in others they held regional power as emirs or beys. Most notably, Mamluk factions seized the sultanate centered on Egypt and Syria and controlled it as the Mamluk Sultanate from 1250 to 1517. The Mamluk Sultanate famously defeated the Ilkhanate of the Battle of Ain Jalut. They had earlier fought the Western European Christian Crusaders in 1154 to 1169 and 1213 to 1221, effectively driving them out of Egypt and the Levant. In 1302, the Mamluk Sultanate formally expelled the last Crusaders from the Levant, ending the era of the Crusades. While Mamluks were purchased as property, their status was above ordinary slaves, and were not allowed to carry weapons or perform. Who were not allowed to perform. While the Mamluks were purchased as property, their status was above ordinary slaves, who were not allowed to carry weapons or perform certain tasks. In places such as Egypt, and from the Ayyubid dynasty to the time of Muhammad Ali of Egypt, Mamluks were considered to be, quote, true lords and, quote, true warriors, with social status above the general population in Egypt and the Levant. In a sense, they were like enslaved mercenaries. It looks like what Fleff might have been referring to is, what was it? The empire or whatever they had. So I gotta look at that too, because I have no idea. Like, I don't know what a Mamluk is. God damn it, where the hell? The Mamluk Sultanate, that's what I'm looking for, I think. The Mamluk, or Mamluk Sultanate, also known as Mamluk Egypt or Mamluk Empire, was a state that ruled Egypt, the Levant, and Hejaz from the mid-13th to early 16th centuries. The Mamluk Sultanate was ruled by a military caste of Mamluks, freed slave soldiers headed by a sultan. The Sultanate was established with the overthrow of the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt in 1250 and was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in 1517. Mamluk history is generally divided into Turkic or Bari period, 1250 to 1382, and the Circassian or Burji period, 1382 to 1517, called after the predominant ethnicity or core of the ruling Mamluks during these respective eras. The first rulers of the Sultanate hailed from the Mamluk regimes of the Ayyubid Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, surpassing power, 1240 to 1249, usurping power from his successor in 1250. The Mamluks under Sultan Qutuz and Baybars routed the Mongols in 1260, halting their southward expansion. They then conquered or gained suzerainty over the Ayyubids' Syrian principalities. By the end of the 13th century, through the efforts of Sultan Baybars, Kaluwan 1279 to 1290, and Al-Ashraf Khalil 1290 to 1293, they conquered the Crusader states, expanded into Makuria, Nubia, Cyrenaica, the Hejaz, and southern Anatolia. The Sultanate then experienced a long period of stability and prosperity during the third reign of Al-Nasir Muhammad, before giving away the internal strife characterizing the succession of his sons. Then real power was held by senior emirs. One such emir, Barkuk, overthrew the Sultan in 1390, inaugurating Burji rule. Mamluk authority across the empire eroded under his successors due to foreign invasions, tribal rebellions, and natural disasters, and the state entered into a long period of financial distress. Under Sultan Bars Bey, major efforts were taken to replenish the treasury, particularly monopolization of trade, with Europe and tax expeditions into the countryside. So that's that. Back to the text. Let us examine the main characteristics of Arab feudalism under the Mamelukes. Here, the subjugation of the peasants to the strong feudal state was much harsher than in medieval Europe, but the individual member of the ruling class had no individual property rights whatsoever. The Sultan was the only landowner, and he used to divide the right to collect the rent in the various regions among the different nobles, called Mu'tasims. I don't know. While in Europe every feudal lord was the owner of a certain domain which was handed down from father to son, in the Arab East the feudal lord had no permanent domain of his own, but was a member of a class which collectively controlled the land and had the right to appropriate rent. In Syria and Palestine, the area from which these feudal lords collected rent was changed from year to year. In Egypt, they received the right to collect the rent in a certain area for their whole lives, and their heirs had a prior right in the appointment of the deceased successor. While in Europe, the feudal lord was relatively an independent power against the king, who was no more than the first feudal lord. In the Arab East, only the feudal collective was a factor of any consequence. As individuals, the Arab nobles were weak because they were dependent on the state for their position. The weakness of the feudal lord as against the state was clearly indicated by the way in which the fiefs were allocated. The Sultan distributed them by lot among the emirs and knights, each getting a portion of land differing in size and quality according to his rank. The Arab nobles were thus divided into different groups with different incomes, the distinction between them being very great. For instance, the, quote, emirs of the 100, end quote, got 80,000 to 200,000 dinar jaishi a year, quote, emir al-Tabu, end quote, 23,000 to 3,000, quote, emirs of the 10, end quote, 9,000 and below, quote, emirs of the 5, end quote, 3,000 and so on. The form of appropriation was much more like that of a state official than that of a European feudal lord. As a result of this dependence of the nobles on the state, an unusual phenomenon recurred in the Arab East. From time to time, whole feudal strata were, quote, purged and annihilated, others arising in their places. The Arab lords were replaced by the Sultan's free slaves, the Mamluks, who were not of Arab origin and did not speak Arabic but Turkish. In the 13th and 14th centuries, they mostly originated from the Mongolian state, the Golden Horde, whose center was on the banks of the lower Volga. In the 15th and 16th centuries, they were mainly Caucasian. With the Tsar's increasing resistance to conscription in the Caucasus for the Sultan, the Balkan element, Albanians, Bosnians, etc., predominated. The ownership of the land by the state not only prevented the rise of feudalism based on private property, but also of any social group with individualistic tendencies whatsoever. The town was a military camp. The majority of the artisans were not independent. Even when guilds Hirfe did develop, they did not attain any importance at all in the towns and did not become an independent force of any importance. The government subordinated them to itself by appointing many of the heads of the guilds, making them its officials, and turning the guilds into government organizations. The fact that the main means of production, the land, belonged not to individuals but to the state, and that the Arab nobles and the Mamluks lacked juridical footholds and therefore did not have the right to inherit, did not improve the position of the peasant masses, nor did the plebeian origin of the Mamluks affect any change. The concentration of the ruling class of the Arab East in the towns afforded them great military power over the peasants and furthermore increased their appetites. In this, too, they differed from the European feudal lords in the Middle Ages. The produce which the European serfs gave to their feudal lords as rent was generally not sent out to be sold. The serfs, therefore, could not... I think there's a word here. Did not need to give their feudal lord more than he and his household needed for daily use. Quote, the walls of the feudal lord's stomach set the limits to his exploitation of the peasants, end quote, Marx. The Arab feudals had different tastes, and their point of view might be summed up in the words used by Caliph Suleiman to his emissary about the peasants. Quote, milk till the udder be dry, and let blood to the last drop, end quote. The mode of production, the form of exploitation, the relation of the toilers to the means of production in the Arab East was the same as in medieval Europe. The source of income of the ruling class was also the same. The only difference was in the mode of appropriation, in the legal expression of the right to exploit. Footnote. Sources used on feudalism in the Arab East. A.N. Polyak, Feudalism in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon, London, 1939. A.N. Polyak, Les révoltes populaires en Égypte et à l'époque des Mamelouks et leur cause économique. And Paliuk, various articles that appeared in Hebrew in the periodical Hamashek Hishatun Tui, Tel Aviv. Anyway, end footnote. Wikipedia says Abraham Nahum Polak, sometimes referred as A.N. Polak or Polyak, born the 2nd of September 1910, died March 5th, 1970, was an Israeli historian, professor at the Tel Aviv University since its inception, professor of medieval history, and founder of the Department of Middle Eastern History. Abraham Nahum Polak's main areas of research were Jewish history, Arab history, nations of Islam in Africa, and the history of the Khazars. Okay. So end footnote, new section. The Russian bureaucracy, a gendarme who appears in the process of distribution? Question mark. Trotsky writes that the Stalinist state's coercion of the masses is the result of, quote, the fact that the present transitional structure is still full of social contradictions, which in the sphere of consumption most closely and sensitively felt by all, are extremely tense and forever threaten to break over into the sphere of production. Therefore, quote, the basis of bureaucratic rule is the poverty of society and objects of consumption, with the resulting struggle of each against all. When there is enough goods in a store, the purchasers can come whenever they want to. When there is little goods, the purchasers are compelled to stand in line. When the lines are very long, it is necessary to appoint a policeman to keep order. Such is the starting point of the power of the Soviet bureaucracy. It, quote, knows, end quote, who is to get something and who has to wait, end quote. It is true that the bureaucracy appears as the, quote, gendarme, end quote, in the process of distribution only, or does it appear so in the process of reproduction as a whole, of which the former is but a subordinate part? This is of infinite theoretical and political importance. Before attempting to answer this question, let us examine what Marx and Engels thought about the connection between the relations of production and distribution. Marx writes, quote, to the single individual, distribution naturally appears as a law established by the society, determining his position in the sphere of production, within which he produces, and thus antedating production. At the outset, the individual has no capital, no landed property. From his birth, he is assigned to wage labor by the social process of distribution. But this very condition of being assigned to wage labor is the result of the existence of capital and landed property as independent agents of production. From the point of view of society as a whole, distribution seems to antedate and to determine production in another way as well, as a pre-economic fact, so to say. A conquering people divides the land among the conquerors, establishing thereby a certain division and form of landed property and determining the character of production, or it turns the conquered people into slaves and thus makes slave labor the basis of production. Or a nation by revolution breaks up large estates into small parcels of land, and by this new distribution imparts to production a new character. Or legislation perpetuates land ownership in large families or distributes labor as a hereditary privilege and thus fixes it in caste. In all these cases, they are all historic. It is not distribution that seems to be organized and determined by production, but on the contrary, production by distribution. In the most shallow conception of distribution, the latter appears as a distribution of products, and to that extent as further removed from and quasi-independent of production. But before distribution means distribution of production, is first a distribution of the means of production, and second, what is practically another wording of the same fact, is a distribution of the members of society among the various kinds of production, the subjection of individuals to certain conditions of production. The distribution of products is manifestly a result of this distribution, which is bound up with the process of production and determines the very organizing of production. That's from Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. This extract from Marx, the essence of which is repeated time and time again throughout his work, is sufficient as a point of departure for the analysis of the place of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the economy. Let's pose these questions in connection with the Russian bureaucracy. Does the bureaucracy only administer the distribution of means of consumption among people, or does the Russian bureaucracy administer the distribution of the people in the process of production? Does the bureaucracy exercise a monopoly over the control of distribution only, or over the control of the means of production as well? Does the bureaucracy ration means of consumption only, or does the bureaucracy also distribute the total labor time of society between accumulation and consumption, between the production of means of production and that of means of consumption? Does not the bureaucracy reproduce the scarcity of means of consumption, and thus certain relations of distribution? Do the relations of production prevailing in Russia not determine the relations of distribution which comprise a part of them? New section: Social revolution or political revolution. If one agrees with Trotsky that a revolution by the working class of Russia against the bureaucracy is not a social revolution, one enters into immediate contradictions with Marxian sociology. The Civil War in the United States was defined by Marx as a social revolution. The liberation of slaves and their transformation into wage earners was a social revolution. One class in society disappeared and gave place to another. Why should the overthrow of Stalin's bureaucracy and the liberation of the millions of slaves in the labor camps not be a social revolution, but merely a political revolution? The agrarian revolution, transferring the feudal state estates to peasant hands, transferring serfs into free peasants, was a social revolution. Why should not the cessation of state plunder, of, quote, obligatory deliveries, end quote, the transformation of the kolkhoz into the real property of the kolkhoz members, and controlled by them, not be a social revolution? A political revolution assumes that the change in government only individuals... A political revolution assumes that with the change in government, only individuals, groups, or ruling layers change, but the same class retains power. Accordingly, the bureaucrat and the worker, the NKVD guard and his prisoner, belong to the same class. How can this be, when their positions in the process of production are so antagonistic? When their attitudes to the means of production do not only, or are not the same, but actually clash sharply? If we accept that the workers and bureaucrats do belong to the same class, then we must conclude that in Russia there is a struggle inside one class, but no struggle between classes, that is, no class struggle. Does not this take the ground from under Trotsky's attack on Stalin's assertion that there is no class struggle in Russia? Trotsky's last book. As the working class in Russia was the only one to hold power for any length of time, as its overthrow took an unpredictable form in the very complicated economic and political circumstances of Russia, it is no accident that even Trotsky, with his brilliant analytical faculties, had to reevaluate his basic analysis of the Stalinist regime from time to time. A tremendous shift took place in Trotsky's position, if only an emphasis from the acceptance of the theory of the degenerated worker state as a condition for membership of the left opposition, till the time that Trotsky did not propose the exclusion of the anti-defensists from the International. Although he did not accept their position, it was no accident that in his polemic with Shachtman at the end of 1939 and in 1940, Trotsky could say that even though he might be in a minority against Shachtman and Burnham, he would oppose a split and would continue to fight for his position in the United Party. Footnote. Trotsky, In Defense of Marxism, New York, 1942, pages 63 to 70. That's weird because In Defense of Marxism is an entire, is a collection mostly of letters. So if it's not saying what letter, that footnote's pretty fucking useless. A clear step in the direction of a new evaluation of the bureaucracy as a ruling class finds expression in Trotsky's last book, Stalin. In explaining the social nature of the Stalinist bureaucracy's rise to power, he said, quote, "The substance of the Thermidor was, is, and could not fail to be social in character. It stood for the crystallization of a new privileged stratum, the creation of a new substratum for the economically dominant class. There were two pretenders to this rule, the petty bourgeoisie and the bureaucracy itself. They fought shoulder to shoulder in the battle to break the resistance of the proletarian vanguard. When that task was accomplished, a savage struggle broke out between them. The bureaucracy became frightened of its isolation, its divorcement from the proletariat. Alone it could not crush the kulak, nor the petty bourgeoisie that had grown and continued to grow on the basis of the NEP. It had to have the aid of the proletariat. Hence its concerted effort to present its struggle against the petty bourgeoisie for the surplus products and for power as the struggle of the proletariat against attempts at capitalist restoration." End quote. Trotsky in Stalin. The bureaucracy, Trotsky says, while pretending to fight against capitalistic restoration, in reality uses the proletariat only to crush the kulaks for, quote, the crystallization of a new privileged stratum, the creation of a new substratum for the economically dominant class, end quote. One of the pretenders to the role of economically dominant class, he says, is the bureaucracy. Great significance must be attached to this formulation, especially if we connect this analysis of the fight between the bureaucracy and the kulaks with Trotsky's definition of the class struggle. He says, quote, "The class struggle is nothing else than the struggle for surplus produce. He who owns surplus produce is master of the situation, owns wealth, owns the state, has the key to the church, to the courts, to the sciences, and the arts." End quote. Trotsky. The Living Thoughts of Karl Marx. Was that? I want to see something real quick, because I think that might have been written with Otto Rula of Council Communism fame. I want to see something. Maybe I'm making that up. There's a relationship between Otto Rule and Trotsky at the end of their life. There's like pictures of them together. I think Otto Rule, he was in exile, obviously, during the Third Reich, and I think he took exile in Mexico and visited Trotsky in Mexico. But yeah. So anyway, back to the text. So it's the end of the Trotsky quote. The fight between the bureaucracy and the kulaks was, according to Trotsky's last conclusion, the quote struggle ... for the surplus products, end quote. The internal forces, new section. The internal forces are not able to restore individual capitalism in Russia. What conclusion as regards its class character? When Trotsky spoke about the danger of social counter-revolution in Russia, he meant the restoration of capitalism based on private property. Stalinist Bonapartism is represented as a balancing factor between two forces on the national arena. On the one hand, the working class supported statified property and planning, and on the other, the bourgeois element striving towards individual property. He writes, quote, the bureaucracy, continues to preserve state property only to the extent that it fears the proletariat. This saving fear is nourished and supported by the illegal party of Bolshevik Leninists, which is the most conscious expression of the socialist tendencies opposing that bourgeois reaction with which the Thermidorian bureaucracy is completely saturated. As a conscious political force, the bureaucracy has betrayed the revolution, but a victorious revolution is fortunately not only a program and a banner, not only political institutions, but also a system of social relations. To betray it is not enough. You have to overthrow it, end quote. Trotsky. That's from The Revolution Betrayed. This presentation exposes most clearly the juridical abstraction of the form of property and exposes most clearly, therefore, the internal contradictions of the analysis. The Russian proletariat was not strong enough to keep its control over the means of production and was ousted by the bureaucracy, but it is strong enough to prevent the promulgation of this relation in law. The proletariat was not strong enough to check a most antagonistic distribution of production, to prevent the bureaucracy from brutally depressing its standard of living, and denying the proletariat the most elementary rights, to prevent the sentence of millions of its members to slave labor in Siberia, but it is strong enough to defend the form of property. As though there is any relation between people and property other than that based on the relations of production. Moreover, if the fear of the proletariat is the only factor preventing the restoration of private capitalism in Russia, if, as Trotsky said, the bureaucracy are conscious restorationists, Trotsky's statement that the Stalinist regime is as stable as a pyramid standing on its head would have proved correct, and his prognosis of the fate of the statified economy during the war would have been realized. He summed up his position thus, quote, "In the heated atmosphere of the war, one can expect sharp turns towards individualistic principles in agriculture and in handicraft industry, toward the attraction of foreign and, quote, allied, end quote, capital, breaks in the monopoly of foreign trade, the weakening of governmental control over the trusts, sharpening or competition between the trusts, their conflict with workers, etc. In the political sphere, these processes may mean the completion of Bonapartism with the corresponding change or number of changes in property relations. In other words, in case of a protracted war accompanied by the passivity of the world proletariat, the internal social contradictions in the USSR not only might lead, but would have to lead to a bourgeois Bonapartist counter-revolution." It seems to me that this kind of, maybe this is just a side note, but I think historically, this type of prognosis of greater individualism during the World War II in the Soviet Union was not the case. To my understanding, based upon the work of what the fuck is his name? Now it is eluding me. Donald Filzer and Wendy Z. Goldman's book on the Soviet home front. I haven't read it, but I've listened to lectures, so I shouldn't say the book. I should just say the lectures, or a lecture from it. According to Donald Filzer, who, if you don't know who Donald Filzer is, he's one of the most well-known labor historians of the Stalin period, and he was basically saying that the Soviet system, the Soviet establishment, Stalin, and all of the things associated with Stalinism, never had more popular support at any point than during World War II. And I think he also says that that applies. Don Filzer says that applies for the Soviet state as a whole. The World War II was an extremely collectivizing force, a force of social cohesion within the Soviet Union, despite the destruction in terms of solidarity or fidelity to the ruling class. This greatly increased during World War II. Let's see what Tony Cliff says after that quote. That quote was, by the way, from War in the Fourth International. Tony Cliff says, before the experience of World War II, it was an understandable if incorrect assumption that private capitalism could be restored in Russia without its occupation by an imperialist power. But the victory of the concentrated, statified Russian economy over the German war machine silenced all talk of such a possibility. The fact that external forces could restore individual capitalism, or even that a devastating war, accompanied by the annihilation of most of the Russian population, could cast her back to a much lower level of historical development than private capitalism is not excluded, however. When Trotsky defined Russia as a society in transition, Trotsky emphasized correctly that as such it must be its own immanent laws. By its own immanent laws lead either to the victory of socialism or to the restoration of private capitalism. If the latter is ruled out, one of three possibilities remains. 1. The internal forces in Russia lead in one direction only, towards communism. This point of view is held by the Stalinists and also by Bruno Rizzi. 2. Russian society is neither capitalist nor socialist, although the productive forces rise uninterruptedly. It will not lead to communism, although the exploitation of the masses continues unabated. It will not lead to capitalism. This is the theory of the, quote, managerial revolution, end quote, and of bureaucratic collectivism in Shachtman's 1943 formulation. I don't know what formulation that's referencing. Three, Russian society is either a transitional society. Three, Russia in society is either a transitional society, which has two possible paths before it: state capitalism or socialism, or it is already state capitalism. Denying the possibility of the internal forces leading to private capitalism, and at the same time repudiating Stalinism, bureaucratic collectivism, according to both Bruno R. and Shachtman's formulation, and Burnhamism, we are left with the third alternative only. Under both state capitalism and a worker state, the state is the repository of the means of production. The difference between the two systems cannot be in the form of property. Therefore, the state ownership of the means of production, which Trotsky uses as the basis for his definition of the class character of Russia, must be dismissed as an unsound criterion. New section. The quote, new democracies, end quote, and the definition of Russia as a worker state. The appearance of the quote, new democracies, end quote, provided a test of the definition of Russia as a worker state. If state property, planning, and monopoly of foreign trade define a country as a worker state, then without doubt Russia, as well as the quote, new democracies, are worker states. This means that in the latter proletarian revolutions have taken place. These were led by the Stalinists and on the basis of national unity, government coalitions with the bourgeoisie and chauvinism which led to the expulsion of millions of German toilers and their families. Such policies merely served to oil the wheels of the proletarian revolution. What then is the future of international socialism? And what is the future of international socialism? What is its historical justification? The Stalinist parties have all the advantages over the international socialists: a state apparatus, mass organizations, money, etc. The only advantage they lack is the internationalist class ideology. But if it is possible to accomplish the proletarian revolution without this ideology, why should the workers move away from Stalinism? If a social revolution took place in Eastern Europe and countries without a revolutionary proletarian leadership, If a social revolution took place in the Eastern European countries without a revolutionary proletarian leadership, we must conclude that in future social revolutions, as in past one, the masses will do the fighting but not the leading. To assume that the, quote, new democracies, end quote, are worker states means to accept that in principle the proletarian revolution is, just as the bourgeois wars were, based on the deception of the people. If the, quote, new democracies, end quote, are worker states, Stalin has realized the proletarian revolution. Moreover, he carried it out quite speedily. 47 years passed from the Paris Commune to the establishment of the first worker state in a country of 140 million people. Less than 40 years passed until a number of additional countries became worker states. In the West, Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia added their 75 million people, and this does not include the Baltic states, East Poland, and Bessarabia, containing 20 million people, which were annexed to the USSR. In the East, China, with 600 million people, was added. If these countries are worker states, then why Marxism? Why the Fourth International? If the, quote, new democracies, end quote, are worker states, what Marx and Engels said about the socialist revolution being, quote, history conscious of itself, end quote, is refuted. Refuted is Engels' statement, quote, it is only from this point, the socialist revolution, that men, with full consciousness, will fashion their own history. It is only from this point that the social causes set in motion by men will have, predominantly and in constantly increasing measure, the effects willed by men. It is humanity's leap from the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom, end quote. Engels. That's from Anti-During. Oh. Rosa Luxemburg, end quote, Engels, anti-Düring. Rosa Luxemburg, too, must have spoken nonsense in her summing up of what all the Marxist teachers wrote about the place of proletarian consciousness in a revolution. Quote, in all the class struggles of the past carried through in the interest of the minorities, and in which, to use the words of Marx, quote, all development took place in opposition to the great mass of the people, end quote. One of the essential conditions of action was the ignorance of these masses with regard to the real aims of the struggle, its material content, and its limits. This discrepancy was, in fact, the specific historical basis of the, quote, leading role, end quote, of the, quote, enlightened, end quote, bourgeoisie, which correspond with the role of the masses as docile followers. But as Marx and Engels wrote as early as 1845, quote, as the historical action deepens, the number of masses engaged in the historical action must increase, exclamation point, end quote. The class struggle of the proletariat is the, quote, deepest, end quote, of all historical actions up to our day. It embraces the whole of the lower layers of the people, and from the moment that society became divided into classes, it is the first movement which is in accordance with the real interests of the masses. That is why the enlightenment of the masses, with regard to their tasks and methods, is an indispensable historical condition for socialist action. That is why the enlightenment of the masses with regard to their tasks and methods is an indispensable historical condition for socialist action, just as in former periods the ignorance of the masses was the condition for the action of the dominant classes. New section. Are Russia's war victories proof that Russia is a workers' state? Whereas Trotsky followed up his analysis that Russia is the degenerated workers' state, predicted that the bureaucracy would not stand up to a war, many Trotskyists today conclude from these very victories that Russia is a workers' state. This post-factum argument, however, cannot stand up to criticism. The argument can be broken up into two parts. One, the enthusiasm of the masses in the war proves that they have something to lose besides their chains, that they are the ruling class. Two, the industrial military strength of Russia proves the historical superiority of the Russian regime over capitalism. The first part of the argument, prevalent in the Fourth International Press in 1941-43, had the bottom knocked out of it by the course of events. The German army, too, in the years when all hope of victory had already vanished, fought with all its strength to the very gates of Berlin. Had the German soldiers also something to lose besides their chains? Was the German working class also the ruling class? As regards the second part of the argument, there is no doubt that large-scale enterprise has tremendous advantages over small-scale. This indeed explains to a certain extent the superiority of American production to British, although both are based on the same social system. Russian industry, newer and technically more modern, is built on an even larger scale than American. Besides, the overlapping and lack of coordination prevalent in the countries of individual capitalism is avoided in Russia by state ownership of the means of production. And yet another advantage in a war, which many other countries cannot claim, is that her workers lack all democratic rights. In Russia, as in Nazi Germany, it is possible to produce guns instead of butter, to transfer millions of workers from the West to beyond the Urals, housing them in dugouts in the ground, without fear of organized opposition. The authority of the state over the economy and over the workers. These are the strong points of Russia's industrial military production. But these are the very factors which explain Nazi Germany's military superiority over bourgeois democratic France, which, as we know, collapsed before her advancing armies like a house of cards. And even Britain, this quote, workshop of the world, end quote, was saved from invasion only by the English Channel, by American help from the West, and by the Russian threat to Germany from the East. Germany's military victories at the beginning of the war fooled some people into believing that Germany was not a capitalist country, but represented a new and superior system of society. Burnham was notable among these. The belief that the Russian military victories in themselves prove that Russia represents a new system of society has no more foundation than the belief that Nazi Germany did so. New section. What prevented Trotsky from renouncing the theory of Russia? What prevented Trotsky from renouncing the theory that Russia is a worker state? One tends to see the future in the trappings of the past. For many years, the socialists who fought exploitation fought against the owners of private property, the bourgeoisie. When Lenin, Trotsky, and the rest of the Bolshevik leaders said that if the worker state of Russia remained isolated, it was doomed, they envisaged that doom in a definite form, the restoration of private property, while state property was seen as the fruit of the struggle of the working people. From here, it was only one step to the conclusion that if state ownership existed in Russia, it was thanks to the bureaucracy's fear of the working class, and conversely, if the bureaucracy strove to increase its privileges, including the right of inheritance, it strove to restore private ownership. Past experience was Trotsky's main impediment in grasping the fact that a triumph for reaction does not always mean a return to the original point of departure, but may lead to a decline in a spiral form in which are combined elements of the pre-revolutionary and of the revolutionary past, the latter subordinated to the former. The old capitalist class content will then emerge in a new, quote, socialist, end quote, form, thus serving as further confirmation of the law of combined development, a law which Trotsky himself did so much to develop. In summing up, it may be said that while Trotsky contributed incomparably more than any other Marxist to an understanding of the Stalinist regime, his analysis suffered from one serious limitation, a conservative attachment to formalism, which by its nature is contradictory to Marxism, that subordinates form to content. The end. Thank you for listening.